Hello and welcome to the NIHR Dementia Researcher midday lecture webinar. I'm Adam Smith. I'm the Program Director at the UCL Institute of Neurology and for the NIHR. I'm joined today by Cara Sass, Dr. Cara Sass. Hello, Cara.
Hello.
Cara is currently a research fellow at Leeds University. However, prior to this, she completed her PhD at Leeds Beckett. And today, I think it's that work with your PhD that you're going to talk about, which is presenting some of the work around the impact of sport reminiscence for men living with dementia. I'm particularly interested in this because I think sports reminiscence is something that's discussed quite a lot on social media. However, often it's more the delivery of this and rather than the research behind it. So I'm particularly interested to hear more about the research behind this. The talk will be around 20 minutes for those that haven't joined us before, and there'll be time for questions at the end. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to post your questions. I will then put them to Cara at the end, and so she can answer them live. We're also recording today's webinar, so if for any reason you drop out, don't worry, you'll be able to watch this back via our website, probably from sometime later today. So thank you very much. That's enough from me. Thanks for joining us. And Cara, if you could perhaps share your screen now.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today to listen to this webinar. So as Adam just said, my name's Cara. In May this year, I finished my PhD with the Centre for Dementia Research at Leeds Beckett University. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. My project began in 2017. It's titled Understanding the Impact of Sporting Reminiscence on Men Living with Dementia. So let me start with some background to my project. So dementia is associated with negative impacts on well-being, in part because the effects of dementia can lead a person to becoming socially isolated and lonely. For example, a person might be forced to give up work or regular activity and lose contact with their friends. The likelihood of social isolation is known to be significantly worse for older men than for women, and this is a risk factor for poor health outcomes. Now, we can offer social support to people with dementia who are isolated in the community through groups and activities, but because the uptake is lower for men, a common assumption is that they are hard to engage and would rather avoid offers of support from other people. But in reality, there's often a lack of suitable opportunities for social activity that's appropriate to the interests of men with dementia. What researchers have shown from actually asking men about their experiences is that men can adopt some common ways of coping with the effects of dementia, such as learning to manage their activity and taking charge of their health. And even the most fiercely self-reliant men can get their heads around accepting help from others if it helps them to maintain their independence for longer. So what do older men in general prefer their support to look like? So existing research studies have shown that men have a preference for all male groups so that they can be among like-minded people. Desirable activities can include work or manual activity or build on their existing interests. So as you can see from the pictures there, we've got some men doing shed work, spending some time talking about sport as well. The way groups are advertised is also important. So the advert on the right is an example of wording that focuses on the activity and the social benefits of a group rather than using terms like support or referring directly to dementia. So this could reduce the stigma that's associated with seeking help. And this is where sporting reminiscence comes in. So facilitated reminiscence is an established activity for people living with dementia to take part in because it fulfills that need for meaningful engagement with other people. Reminiscence itself focuses on robust formative memories of our past to stimulate conversation and bring important aspects of our identities to light. You might have thought before today about your own favourite memory related to sport, and love it or hate it, sport's a universal pastime and it's really tightly woven through meaningful social moments in the lives of many men from childhood. By focusing reminiscence on a topic with universal appeal to a large proportion of men, This creates a wealth of opportunities to engage them in reminiscence while trusting that it's going to meet with their interests. There's been a really big increase in these kinds of activities over the UK in recent years, and you might have heard of Sporting Memories before, but they're a nationwide charity that run groups involving reminiscence based on sport, and they're aimed at anyone over the age of 50 that's experiencing dementia or loneliness or depression. They tend to be held in sports grounds like football or cricket clubs, but quite a few of them are also in local libraries and community centres as well. So the evidence currently suggests that reminiscing on sport in a group can lead to improvements in mood, cognitive functioning and well-being. And the sessions bring opportunities to celebrate people's expertise and their achievements and their sporting skills as well. And that can lead to a sense of pride and self-esteem. Reminiscing on shared memories with others can give a sense of companionship, improving social inclusion and tackling loneliness. But the existing research evidence is mostly based on anecdotal accounts. So really you just get a few snippets of information about why it's effective, and there's no real element of keeping track of those benefits over time. There's also been very few accounts from men themselves, especially those living with dementia, about what these kind of groups mean to them. So this brings us to my project. Okay, so for my study, I used a research technique called ethnography. This brings together a few different methods. So for my study, it involved joining in with and observing weekly sessions and taking notes about the environment and the interactions taking place among the people around me. I also carried out interviews with group members and with family and friends and the people that were facilitating the groups as well. Now I spent a total of 13 months in the field, attending 5 different groups in the north of England over the time. So these were spread from the west to the east of England, with a couple in Yorkshire as well. The groups were a variety of sizes and different settings so that I could get a bit of a distribution of the different features of the groups too. Using these methods, I wanted to ask 4 questions of the groups taking part. So the first one, what do men living with dementia and their families consider the impact of sporting memories on their health and well-being when they're taking part? Secondly, what is it about sporting memories groups that actually appeals to men? My third question, is there anything that makes it more difficult for men with dementia to take part in groups in their communities? And finally, what recommendations can be shared with other organisations wanting to involve men in their groups? So from this, I've gathered a mountain of data with the observation notes and conversational data being drawn together under a set of themes that address each of the questions on the slide. So I'd like to share some of the themes with you today, and I'll be using quotes from my participants to illustrate each one. The first theme relates to the opportunities that men had to connect with each other through sport. So here we have a quote from a group member's wife around the benefits to having sport as a topic of focus in the groups. So she says, I think it's more difficult for the men, and therefore I think the fact you're saying sport, immediately they can grab that as something, oh, that might be okay for me, you know, and it's not that sort of soft or, you know, it's for me, it's for the men. So what she's referring to at the beginning is a common belief that from the wives that the nature of their partners' relationships with others meant they often had fewer opportunities to create the kind of meaningful relationships that they could use for support. For this reason, she believes that the experience of dementia could actually be harder to deal with for the men she knew compared to women in the same position. What the quote shows is that the fact that sport can open up that opportunity for men to engage with their peers if they've been left without opportunities to do so by changes in their situations. So the context of sport bringing people together was seen as less touchy-feely than the idea of a support group, and it was sort of like a gateway to forming those bonds. So the next theme goes further into exploring what these bonds can do to improve the well-being of men with dementia at Sporting Memories. So this quote's from a woman whose husband sadly passed away in the early stages of my project. She actually continues to volunteer regularly because of the impact that the groups had on both of their lives. So she says, you realise that actually everyone who's here because of their dementia had varying responses to things. So if Kevin decided to do one of his ad-libbed comments, it didn't actually matter because someone had said worse, you know? So it was fine. We started to actually look forward to going. It became a focal point for our week in a way. The other things he liked doing in his life, he couldn't do. So what she said here reflects an unconscious kind of safety net or boundary that the group created for her and her husband, so they could feel free from judgment or awkwardness because of the bonds they'd formed in the group. The fear of embarrassment is something that can stop many people from taking the first step to joining in with the groups, out of concern that they might be misunderstood or not fit in with people that they meet. So this shows the benefit to joining in with a group that's not necessarily exclusive to people with dementia, but one that's openly accepting of differences and promotes understanding. So the next slide is a quote from a group leader, and it's related to the ways that sporting memories can unlock new paths to communicating with men with dementia. So the facilitator says, every time he told me it would add a little bit more detail, he remembered more. So it was great in terms of getting his synapses firing. It was drawing more out of his brain, so to speak. It was definitely worth hearing all 4 or 5 variations on the theme. And I said, so it's like a rehearsal almost. Well, yeah, every time he told me, I could ask him a different question, which again led him to think about other things. I think with experience, you just learn how to flow with it. A lot of it is just purely about active listening. So there were many times when being at the groups gave men opportunities to interact and tell fascinating sporting stories that they wouldn't have had in their usual surroundings. Through my observations, there were lots of examples like this of behaviours and reactions being drawn out of people through the act of reminiscing, and having someone there who would take the time to ask the right questions. I love this quote because the volunteer really communicated the value that they placed on being there to draw out these memories from the people that he worked with. Next, we move on to look at the barriers that men can face when trying to take part in groups like sporting memories. So although I'd started my project with the expectation of finding isolated men to speak to, this wasn't actually the case in reality. So almost every person that attended sporting memories had joined because they knew someone who already went, or they attended with a friend or a partner to soften the blow of walking into a room full of strangers. So this quote was a typical example of how someone might decide whether a group would be suitable for them. So he says, you're comfortable if you know somebody, not just at sporting memories, wherever you go, if you know a friendly face. If I'd seen this advertised and I didn't know anybody, I'd have thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what they do there. And that would have been my interest finished. So I think many of us would probably identify with this man because the prospect of just turning up and meeting an entirely new group of people can be very nerve-wracking. This suggests that it's not enough to simply launch a new group, but more could be done to support isolated men to attend different groups that fit with their interests. This might be done using maybe befriending services or any forms of outreach from volunteers to ease them in gradually. Another focus of my observations was how the number of people in a group affected the quality of their interactions and how supportive the environment could be for men with dementia. So this one is from a facilitator at a group that had quite a small ratio of men with dementia compared to those without. So she says, there's one gentleman who would really like to have a bit more of a voice, but he does get talked over a little bit. And there should be that respect within the group to say, hang on a minute, just listen to him. But there's so many strong personalities in there that they can get a little bit swamped by the tide of repartee and banter that goes on so quickly. And they have voices that need to be heard as well. So generally in the more lively groups, the atmosphere coupled with banter and joking around seemed to really help the men acclimatise, and they often showed this by being more alert and responding to that repartee that's being described here. But there was a trade-off because this could make it more difficult for them to actively take part. This was something that the group leaders had to be aware of, so they could do more to involve them, such as inviting them to speak or organising smaller activities where they could work together in small groups. Other important barriers to consider were whether the person could attend alone or with minimal support. So on some occasions where the men maybe lost the ability to reach the groups under their own steam because they potentially could have lost their driving licences over time, a sense of pride might actually limit them from asking for help from others. The next quote here is from a partner who actually worked in a memory service herself before retiring to support her husband after his young onset dementia. She reflected on the part that memory services played in signposting and sharing information about group support to other people that were coming to terms with the diagnosis. I used to say, well, there's a dementia cafe there, there's singing for the brain, etc. I'd never been to any of those groups, but I was still giving out information. I cringe now when I think about it. I know they're popular, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. Like singing for the brain wouldn't suit Jim because it's all older adults, although he likes music and stuff. So one of the reasons people told me that they hadn't considered groups before was because recommendations were usually very general and they were reluctant to turn up somewhere without knowing what they were getting into. So just getting leaflets about things at the point of a diagnosis can be overwhelming and off-putting. So that can lead to delays in people getting support in those early stages. During my fieldwork, I did see some really good examples of local dementia-focused services, spending time visiting and learning about the Sporting Memories group in their area. So that meant that they were better informed to tell people about what could be suitable for them. Improving the direct links then between different agencies has formed part of my recommendations for other services in the community. This next quote is from a male group facilitator, and it addresses a matter which is often debated by providers of male-orientated activities over whether such groups should fully exclude women and focus on all-male interaction. So on the odd occasion where there's been no women present at all, it can get outrageous. You see, with me being another man, it's like the gloves come off. And I think that sometimes it gets very boyish. It gets a bit of a drag for them. I mean, it's not very often that there are no women in the room. And it just goes to show that both men and women interact in a much healthier way when there's a mix of both. So contrary to what other research has suggested, the consensus from my participants was that groups shouldn't be limited to just men. Aside from the fact that many women attending were sports fans in their own right, many of the men relied on wives or daughters or female friends to support them in getting to the groups. And there could sometimes be discomfort if they thought they might be separated from one another after arriving. Women seem to have a tempering influence on the tone, which all parties tended to agree they preferred over all male environments. But in situations where people wanted to have splinter groups to maybe talk about sensitive issues, this was still achievable in a busy session, and it could benefit a cluster of female members as much as the men. Another important issue to consider was that in hosting volunteer-led groups, this involves relying on unpaid members of the community to commit increasing amounts of time to the groups. So this is from a facilitator who said that planning and preparing the sessions initially was a surprise to me, to be told, oh no, the way forward for your new groups is weekly by way of commitment time. You're thinking, blimey, that's going to be a big challenge. With the help of other people who play their part, it makes it easier. But taking a lead on it, there's a lot to it. It puts me under a little bit of pressure. So on top of the commitment of half a day every week, being a group leader also requires time to plan sessions, organise speakers, and sometimes stay on top of resources such as room availability and getting hold of equipment. So many volunteers also maintain personal contact with group members during the week if they have additional needs. So they can spend quite a lot of time in evenings following up with telephone calls as well. Volunteers came from many different backgrounds, meaning that sporting knowledge and experience in working with people living with dementia varied a great deal among the pool of volunteers in every group. Although Sporting Memories do offer training to group leaders as new groups are set up, volunteers can come along and join at any time and quite often get stuck in without there being any assessment of training needs. It is important that volunteers feel capable in contributing to the groups, especially in terms of their confidence in communicating with people with dementia. And they need to be supported by the wider network to make sure they're not taking on too much and putting themselves at risk of stress and strain. A volunteer's confidence and comfort in communicating with people living with dementia was more beneficial to the group as a whole than whether they had a great deal of sporting knowledge. I can attest to this because I took part in the groups for a year, and to this day I'm still averaging a solid 0 out of 10 in all the sports quizzes. So I'm going to end by explaining how I communicated the information that I found in this project in my PhD thesis before thinking about the next steps for sporting memories. The first stage of grouping quotes like these that I've shown you into the themes is known as thematic analysis. So this is a technique that helps to convey really important meanings from the data. Once I'd formed my collection of themes and understood their relationships with the aims of my research, I took them further using a technique called creative nonfiction, which allowed me to turn some of the themes into composite stories. So this can help to obscure people's identities and blur aspects of real life. So it's helpful for confidentiality as much as anything. But it helps to bring home meaningful messages in ways that can resonate with academic and non-academic audiences alike. So each story in my report was presented like a section of text from a novel, and it had characters, dialogue and descriptive information to set the scene before I then discussed each story in relation to knowledge gain and existing theory. But a story is just a starting point, so the richness of ethnographic data brings the possibility of turning research findings into creative media, such as graphic art or performance, given that combination of dialogue and the contextual information, which can easily be translated into picture form or recreated in a dramatic scene. So the boxer in the photograph on the left is a friend of mine who was promoting a monologue that he wrote and performed himself last year. And this is about a man trying to come to terms with his father's young onset dementia. Now this was already a semi-autobiographical play, but because he chose to frame his character's story around dementia, I was able to share some of my participants' experiences from this project with him as he was writing his script. So sharing my own findings in a similar way is something that I'm keen to explore further with my finished stories in the future if my circumstances allow. So a sad consequence of the current situation is the closure of all the face-to-face groups until further notice. We still don't know when it might be possible to open the doors of the groups again or what sessions might look like when they do. Some of the groups were so very popular that physical distancing isn't going to be very easy to manage, and it can be very upsetting for people with dementia being made to keep their distance from their close friends and loved ones. Many people who attend the groups fall into the elevated risk category, so that means there might be even more of a delay for people who are shielding to be able to get out and about in the community. I've been in touch with my participating groups to find out how people are getting on, and they're staying connected to their group members in whatever ways they can. Many of them are embracing technology and joining in regular Zoom calls. I was in one the other day with 60 people across the country. Some groups even have guest speakers and hold regular quizzes and sing-alongs. People without access to the internet have found it more difficult to keep in touch, but they've done so over the telephone, and I even know of one group leader who's been going above and beyond, and he's been delivering newsletters to his group members' doors on his push bike. Something that remained unclear to me during this work was the true scale of the issue of isolated older men in the community. I often wonder whether this period of people staying closer to home and looking around themselves might actually help us to identify more people in need of social engagement. There is the potential then of connecting them with groups like Sporting Memories when we get to the other side of this pandemic. It's definitely a really tough time for many people though, but I'm sure the groups are looking forward to the day that they can return and get some new members in again. So that's a summary of some of the key findings from my project. I hope they've been interesting for you, and I'm happy to take questions, or you can contact me on these details if you want to find out any more information.
Okay, if participants would like to post their questions now using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, I will put those to Cara for you. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. I think I wasn't sure until we got a point through then, so that this isn't just a chat group. They would often try to mix up some form of activity with the group session as well.
Yeah, it varies slightly because some of them are a bit limited in terms of the space they have. There's a couple of them that are in just very small meeting rooms in a library, so it's not as set up to be able to do active sports, but they do have some good spaces, and the ones that have been doing physical activity, they're really creative with it, and it's a really fun thing to be a part of.
And were these groups often bonded over a particular thing? You know, like I'm thinking particularly where you did your PhD. You know, Leeds football fans or Yorkshire cricket fans are kind of, you know, that's something that stays with you for life. Would often these groups of people have a kind of an underlying common background to their reminiscence?
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it went beyond sport as well. I mean, the ones that were based in football clubs, you more likely than anything had everyone from the same club, and they were staunch supporters, and they'd get really into the politics of that club. So I had nothing to say in those conversations.
Oh, and particularly the particular time, like the feelings on a certain player or a certain manager, or how a particular cup final went.
Yeah, it really helped me to listen because I had nothing to input. So that's quite something. But there is a group in Leyland in particular, in Lancashire, and the football ground for the community foundation is actually based in the old Leyland Motors site. So actually a lot of people bonded over sport, but they also worked at the factory. So you've got a lot of people with that shared history as well.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up, because it is interesting, isn't it? Because despite things like the coal mines and steelworks and things having gone from up there, the brass bands still come together. And you could imagine that, you know, people who'd perhaps worked as firemen or firefighters, or of particular factories, or the chocolate factory in York or the biscuit factory in Castleford, you know, places like that, people with those, it didn't have to be sport, but some kind of shared common interest.
Yeah, definitely. And people haven't moved around a great deal from those areas, so they have got a lot of shared memories. I mean, this is something that only on occasion there'd be people there who weren't actually interested in sport, and maybe their partner had kind of just snapped something up because she thought it was male orientated, which is true. So they would come along and still have a lot to impart, but they're not necessarily having to talk about something they're not interested in.
Yeah. And you can see, I mean, funnily enough, as much as COVID's been terrible, there have been some kind of interesting use of technologies and innovations that have come out for it. And I saw recently things like, is it one of the big streaming services, and YouTube and things allows you to do that premiere, so you can synchronize and all watch the same thing at the same time. So you could imagine kind of agreeing to watch an old kind of sports match of some kind, or even, because of course the football's live and back and on terrestrial television for many cases, they could group up and watch a match together.
Yeah, I think viewing parties is a really big way forward. It's just about trying to make sure that more people are connected up, because yeah, I think, like I said, there are a lot of people out there who have got access to the internet and they've got iPads to support them to get online, but for the people that have been left behind by this, they're missing out on a lot of opportunities.
Yeah. And does this, I mean, obviously, I don't know if it wasn't obviously a particular focus for your PhD, but did you come across the application of this same therapy, this same kind of therapeutic system amongst women as well, who either through workplace or through their other interests? I'm thinking things like former WI members, or did women not need these organized groups because that happened naturally anyway? I'm interested.
Yeah, it's something I wanted to be really careful to not stereotype, and it's something that's obviously hard to do when my PhD is about men liking sport. But I suppose women and people from Black and minority ethnicities maybe have historically felt excluded by certain sports in this country, at least. So I think rather than sporting memories being something that excludes women, it's very inclusive of them, but they have to be willing to take that step and get involved with it in the first place to realise that. I think reminiscence in general has been undertaken mainly with women because it's often used in care homes, and they have a great deal of a higher population of women living in care. But it's not something I've come across specific women's interest groups.
And whether that's because, of course, there's also that whole thing of women live longer with the, in that way. So you hadn't got around to it in quite the same way. And you can see, I mean, is this field something that does need to proactively do more to include those kind of Black and minority ethnic groups? Is it, do they struggle with engagement?
Yeah, one of the things with doing ethnography is that you work with the group that you aim to. You identify a group and you go in and see it as it occurs naturally. So although it would have been really nice to have gone out and looked for more representation, it wasn't there, so I couldn't fabricate that.
No.
I think it's something that Sporting Memories really wants to focus on, and they were quite actively looking for somebody to kind of work in their cultural diversity, increasing that engagement when I was finishing writing up. So it would be really nice to see that, because there are so many different sports and rich histories that can be brought in, but whether it's going to be in Sporting Memories groups, whether they're going to be different iterations of that, I'm not entirely sure. I think Sporting Memories could be brought in to different groups that are already out there in the communities, and it'd be really interesting to see what work can be done there.
That's a good idea, just rather integrating it. I know somebody who's got this concept around virtual pubs and things like that, where they do virtual pub groups, and of course, well, there are still this network of working men's clubs, sporting clubs, Labour clubs and conservative clubs up and down the country that could be great hubs, if you like, to bring those together. Those are places that we know struggle these days because the communities aren't using them as much. They'd be great places for this. So we haven't had any questions, unusually, but I do have one last question. So had you got your time over again to redo this, is there anything you would have done slightly differently about your PhD? And if you were, I know you've moved into a different area now, but if you were still working in this area, what work would you have liked to have picked up next? So that's two questions.
Ooh.
Let's take the first one. Would you have done anything differently?
Things differently. I loved the approach of ethnography, and I think that it's a really good starting point for being able to really understand what the issues are. Being someone from a completely different background to everyone I was talking to, I think it was really important to do it that way. So I certainly wouldn't have changed that. I think I would have liked to have spread myself around a few different groups as well, if I had more resource for travel, that sort of thing. I was in each group for quite a long time, so it meant I didn't really move around too much.
Were you mostly in the north as well? I'm wondering whether there's a north-south difference or a difference in, Wales too.
Yeah, this is it. And yeah, Sporting Memories hadn't even opened in Wales by the time I started my data collection. So it would have been nice to have seen if there was more of a spread, because it's still quite general. But yeah, I think I had the foresight to know what was going to happen this year, I think I would have liked to have looked more about what the groups would be able to do in terms of reaching out to people in their homes, not just bringing people into the community as well.
And that's interesting, because I mean there are numerous funding calls out at the moment, particularly from the NIHR in the UK. I'm sure there's the same in other countries too, to very rapidly and quickly fund research to look at how some of the activities that were healthcare based or relied upon physically coming together can still operate in a distanced and safe way. So our website, plug for our website, has a lot of funding calls listed at the moment. So do take a look at those if you think that you've got some ideas. What about if you were, so that would be if you could do this over again, you'd be now, if you were still in this field, you'd be thinking about how this can operate in a new.
Yeah, I think we're really interested to know, the team at Beckett especially, we've still been talking about what's going on with Sporting Memories now, because, you know, just because the groups aren't open, there's this entire membership and there's hundreds of groups across the country. People still want to be very much involved, and I mentioned in my presentation, there was a wonderful meeting last week which was a bit of a one-off for the Great Get Together, but one of the groups in Scotland hosted people from up and down the country getting together and doing a bit of a quiz. So there's amazing opportunities for smaller groups to meet, to actually have a little bit of that connection with people from much further afield. And something that I did notice was a bit of an issue was that groups weren't really able to communicate with one another and share ideas. So if somebody had a really good session plan or maybe activities that they were doing, there wasn't really a forum for them to say to other people, look, this is what I'm doing. But that should hopefully be something that can start to happen now.
Some kind of WhatsApp group, or, you know, some kind of community space. We should talk a little bit. We have had a question from Danny, which I'll come to in a second, but we should talk a little bit about Sporting Memories. So just to understand more, are they is this organisation a charity? Is it funded in some way? Is it a commercial company?
Yeah, they're a charity, and they've had several funding pots. I think they've had quite a large sum from Sport England to be able to open up and increase the number of groups that they have in the UK. And with that, they were also able to provide different sporting equipment for the groups that were already existing, and running challenges for them to win equipment for their groups. So they've really engaged quite a bit with that funding in offering it out to all the groups.
That's wonderful. So if anybody on here feels like donating, I'm sure they'd welcome you. They're certainly on Twitter. I know they are. You should find them out and have a look on their website and see what activities are going on. I'll take this question from Danny Buckley, who asks, thank you so much for your presentation. Was there a specific theme to each session? For example, one sport / one team to focus on, or did each session focus on sport in general? And if so, do you think there was a benefit to such a broad approach?
I think the best engagement seemed to be from the sessions that were tailored. So the groups themselves, they knew the local area, you know, they spent a lot of time researching local players, local events. So they could be on a very broad theme. I went to quite a few that were based on, you know, the Olympics as they were coming around. It was always themed around the time of year. All the way through to a really powerful session that focused on the crash, the Manchester United team air crash, because it was the anniversary had come around, and it was very poignant to that particular club. Having something that really focuses on a very real, very salient memory is always going to be a lot more beneficial than just very broadly talking about a subject. You can really get into those specific memories.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Danny, for the question there. Okay, well, I think we're out of time for today. Thank you very much, Dr. Cara Sass, for agreeing to share with us today. You can find Cara on Twitter, and your name is at SASS_CL, or at SAS_CL. You can also find the recording from today, details of all our future webinars, and the registration and the profile for Cara, all on our website, which is dementiaresearcher.nihr.ac.uk/webinars. Just a reminder that our next webinar is on the 1st of July at 3 p.m, which I think is next Wednesday, where we'll have Eric Dine from Kent State University in the US, going to talk about magnetothermal destruction of beta amyloid and his research into nanoparticles and the use of mild hypothermia to kill amyloid as well. Finally, if you'd like to join us and present your own research as a midday lecture, please do drop us a line. You'll find us on Twitter at dem_researcher, or contact us through the Contact Us page of our website. Thank you very much again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Cara. And do send me your address and I'll get that notepad in the post to you. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Goodbye.
Bye.